Mani Napudni Ninamani. I acknowledge that the land that I live, learn and work on is the traditional unceded land of the Kaurna Mayona, the Kaurna people, and the first scientists of the Adelaide Hills and Plains. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always fun speaking after lunch. You're not sure whether everyone's going to feel revitalised or just fall asleep in a food stupor. So I'm talking on something a little bit different, and I've been doing this at these conferences for a while, and it is great to see that we have doubled the number of talks in wildlife crime this year. So what is wildlife and environmental crime? Well, it is crimes that are perpetrated by individuals or corporations against the environment. There's a couple of examples there that should be reasonably familiar to most people. So it's the illegal killing or taking of wildlife. That particular photo is from Victoria, the first one. Here, this was 400 plus wedge-tailed eagles that were killed on a property by a farmhand, shot and poisoned in 1 year. It's the illegal fisheries, the unregulated take of marine resources. It's habitat destruction and illegal logging and timber clearance. And it's the illegal harvesting, trade and trafficking of Australia's wildlife. There's a common misconception that wildlife and environmental crime is victimless. And in fact, there are victims at all levels. So we have obviously the environmental victims, so our natural resources, our natural capital in Australia, which is depleted through wildlife and environmental crime, through habitat and resource loss. There's human victims as well through the growth in organised and transnational crime and the loss of economic and financial resources and the undermining of social systems. There's the increased zoonotic, pathogenic and disease risk from the wildlife trade. Obviously, you know, it's a distant memory now, but we had a global pandemic which was related directly to the wildlife trade. There's also the reduced wellbeing and quality of life as we lose our environmental resources. Our connection to nature is still incredibly important to us and the resilience of our landscapes and health. And there's huge economic loss as well through depletion of our natural resources and lost economic resources through both agriculture and revenue from tourism. And it's a big problem. So transnationally, through organised crime, it's ranked as fourth in value amongst illicit activities, only behind human and drug trafficking. It's growing at 2 to 3 times the global economy currently. So that's a huge rate of increase. In Australia, the costs have recently been estimated by the AIC as exceeding $1 billion Australian dollars per year. And a big part of this is the illegal wildlife trade, which constitutes a huge proportion of those costs and revenue. Globally, it's valued as highly, the illegal wildlife trade specifically, is valued as highly as $30 billion US dollars every year. It's also a target for increasing criminal activity associated with all of the other organised and serious trafficking crimes. When we look at wildlife and environmental crime prosecutions across Australia, there's a couple of very clear patterns. So one is that prosecutions have occurred recently in all states. So all states are suffering from wildlife and environmental crime. Interestingly, the 2 states which have the highest number of prosecutions are the 2 states which have dedicated natural resource and environmental courts. So you can take that as you will. It's also interesting to note that 2/3 of the crimes have occurred in regional or remote areas. So these are areas which often lack adequate policing resources. They're also the areas for which we have the most biodiversity and the most natural resource. So these are areas which are of greatest concern to us. And when we look at the top crimes, we see that around 1/3 of the wildlife and environmental prosecutions are for illegal habitat clearance and habitat and land loss. They're also for illegal harvesting and take of both terrestrial and marine resources, particularly in the fisheries. We see a couple of particularly prominent commodities, so abalone, rock lobster and sea cucumber are all high in those prosecutions. But then behind those, the next highest rate of wildlife and environmental crime prosecution is the illegal trade and trafficking of live animals, particularly reptiles. So the illegal wildlife trade is, as I've said, one of the most lucrative transnational crimes. It particularly targets rare and endangered species. So it's a collection, and people are drawn to curiosity, to rare, to high value species for which they're hard to get. Rarity, of course, is also a driver of endangerment in biodiversity systems. So there's this self-perpetuating loop where the trade is attracted to rare species but also becomes a driver of rarity and even extinction itself. It has substantial cost to industry through the introduction of invasive species. Australia has a rather torrid history with invasive alien species, huge cost in management and ecological and environmental risk, and has the potential to introduce diseases. There's currently a reptile fungus spreading out of Queensland, which has come in through the wildlife trade, which is causing great concern to ecologists and conservation biologists. And increasingly, it's closely linked to other forms of organised crime as well, particularly money laundering. Perhaps most notable is that the traditional prosecution rates and penalties are substantially lower than other organised serious crimes, although, as we'll talk about, they are improving. So what's the driver of wildlife trade in Australia? Well, Australia has a highly unique and endemic, found nowhere else in the world, flora and fauna. And we're proud of this. We characterise a lot of our identity in these species. And, you know, we think of the very unique, the birds, the reptiles, the plants, but even our charismatic and characteristic species, like kangaroos, have traditionally appeared in wildlife trade markets. So a couple of years ago, 5 red kangaroos were found at large in Bengal, India. They'd been released from private collections. The US has huge numbers of private zoos, and we often find, like in Florida here, not here, we're in Canberra, apparently the best city in Australia. But here's a kangaroo hopping down a highway in Florida from last year. So Australian species are already in these global markets. One of the most desirable and demanded group, though, are our reptiles. So we have around 1,000 endemic and native reptiles to Australia, and they are very unique, and they're highly demanded in the international trade. And recently we've seen an increase in the activity of the traders both domestically and internationally. And we're seeing a large number of these sort of similar reports. Oh, let's not do that, let's go back. These similar reports of police and environmental compliance agency seizures of a broad variety of species. So of those 1,000 species, we have found in international trade around 160 Australian species. Many of those have never been reported, so around 25% of those have never been reported as leaving the country, so there's no record of them in previous accounts. So these are species that are being intentionally smuggled out without the knowledge of any agency. We also find that a number of these all Australian species have great domestic protection before they leave the country. So it's illegal under the Environmental Protection Act to export a species, but once they're outside the country, there is no protection for them. And until very recently, there was no recording or reporting of that trade either. So the Australian government a couple of years ago put 120 plus species on the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species Appendix 3, which requires other states and jurisdictions to start reporting on these species. And we find, all of a sudden that the information about trade increases enormously, but it doesn't stop the international trade. And, this, I used to show a picture of a rhinoceros with its horn shaved off, which I was told I wasn't allowed to do after lunch. But this is still pretty grim here. This is a story of the pygmy blue tongue in South Australia. So it was only rediscovered in 1992. It was believed to be extinct before then. So there's never been a permitted record of trade outside of South Australia. They should not be outside South Australia. And yet we know that they're currently being bred and traded in Victoria and Queensland. And there are even records of them being sold internationally in Eastern and Western Europe. They live in these protected grasslands. The estimates are there's around 5,000 of them. And David Attenborough actually gave a really good how to catch them lesson in one of his documentaries, because they live down spider holes. And if you put a mealworm on a little invertebrate on a piece of string and you dangle it down the spider burrow, you can fish them out. And they're quite easy to extract. Unfortunately, wildlife traffickers don't watch BBC documentaries, and so they tried to dig them up. And what you can see is that this one, there's actually brain material visible there. That one's just had its head just sort of cleaved off as the spade went through it. These are on protected lands. They should be under absolute and complete protection. So where do they go once they get out of Australia? One of the biggest markets is Hong Kong. Not because it's a market in itself, but it's a perfect transit route for the rest of Asia, and particularly for Europe. Netherlands, Germany, Western and Eastern Europe are huge markets for Australia's reptiles. And so what we see is that most of the packages leaving Australia, up to as many as 90% of seized packages are headed directly for Hong Kong, only then to be repurposed and sent to other parts of Europe, North America and Eastern Asia. We are, this was meant to be connected to a slide a couple back, we are having a greater success at prosecutions. So in 2024, a Sydney man was arrested and given a 3.5-year jail sentence for sending packages out of 24 different post offices in Queensland, Victoria, ACT and New South Wales. And these were all through a network of carriers that were taking the packages for him and distributing them across these different post offices. And 3 of that network were also similarly arrested and charged with him. A couple of weeks ago, Neil Simpson, probably Australia's most prolific wildlife trafficker, was jailed for a record 8 years, with 5 years and 4 months non-parole. And these are starting to reflect a change in the sort of judicial understanding of the importance of these crimes, because they're not just environmental, they are economic crimes. These species are worth up to $10,000 individually on international markets. Okay, so that's reptiles. One of the confusing things about the wildlife trade and wildlife and environmental crime is it's almost endless. We have a huge biodiversity, a lot of biological resource for curiosities, antiquities, traditional medicines. In Australia, there was in Tasmania this case a couple of years ago where a member of the public was part of an international bird egg trading scheme. So he was trading with a network of people across Europe and North America. His own collection at the time of arrest consisted of around 3,000 eggs of over 50 species, including wild taken eggs of the critically endangered 40-spotted pardalote. And if you talk to researchers, they have trouble finding nests of 40-spotted pardalotes, but he had eggs of those and was actively trading internationally. So the crime types are endless. The commodities are huge. So where do we find wildlife being traded? Well, one of the big facilitators has been the internet, obviously. And when we look, we see evidence of wildlife trade across all layers, the open, the deep, and the dark web, for different communities. So a lot of Australia's wildlife is still traded domestically and internationally on the open web because surveillance and prosecution rates are still so low. There's a number of closed forum groups, though, for specialised trade. And when you look at the dark web, what we find when we examined it a couple of years ago across 2 million marketplace advertisements, we found around 150 species being traded, but 90% of the advertisements were actually for recreational drug use. So there was some evidence of traditional wildlife trades. There was a little bit of ivory, a little bit of rhino horn, some big cat, tiger, skin, bones and teeth. But the vast majority of wildlife was actually being traded for drug uses. So a conventional crime type, but with a slightly different commodity. And as an example, this is the Sonoran desert toad, and it excretes a poison from its parotid gland, which is high in DMT, a well-known psychedelic. So that's one of the species that's quite commonly traded. And there is another association between drugs and wildlife. So it turns out that a lot of people that produce and trade in drugs are also quite like exotic wildlife. So this was a New South Wales case from a couple of weeks ago. They went in to find drugs. They did find a lot of drugs. But what they also found was a homemade zoo. The man actually wasn't living in his house at the time. He was living out the back because his entire house had been converted into a zoo. He had a saltwater crocodile. Here, this is about just under, or just over 1.5 metre long, and he'd converted one room into an indoor swimming pool for the saltwater crocodile. He had hedgehogs, which are exotic to Australia, if you don't know. A incredible diversity of snakes and reptiles, including a cobra, which is just remarkable. We don't see too many of those, and yet this year already we've had cobras seized both in Queensland and in New South Wales. So, you know, there's a baffling amount of wildlife being traded, both native and exotic in Australia. And it gets weirder and weirder. The growth in the invertebrate trade, exotic pets. So huge numbers of invertebrates, insects and allies being traded across the internet. So this is work that was done by a PhD student, Charlotte Lassaline, in our group, and she's found in 5 years of internet and brick and mortar store surveys, and the internet is across both marketplaces and forums, over 580 invertebrate species traded within Australia. And these include all sorts of crazy things. They include highly threatened species. They include exotic and non-native species, so species that have a genuine and ongoing biosecurity risk, like these giant African snails. Highly venomous species are very, very attractive and popular in the trade. So species that can make you sick or kill you are desirable. And perhaps most baffling is the huge number of undescribed species she's found. So these are species that are under pseudonyms and are not yet known to science, being traded, so particularly amongst our Australian tarantulas. So there's around 60 genera or genus of species that she found for which there were undescribed species being traded in Australia. And you might ask, well, you know, how much do I pay for these things? Oh, actually, we'll carry on. Here's another slide. So this is the sort of diversity you see. So over 100 different families of invertebrates being traded. Around 80% of the trade, though, occurs in just 10 families. And those are scorpions, spiders, tarantulas, stick insects, huge numbers of advertisements for stick insects, and ants are increasingly popular as well. So for a stick insect, you're going to pay around $10. For a scorpion, you're going to pay around $50. For a jumping jack ant queen, you're going to pay $500. For some of the tarantulas, you're going to pay upward of $500 or $600. And for an ant colony, depending on the species, you can be approaching $1,000 for these species. So she estimated the value of this trade in Australia across the websites that she was surveying and found that this is about $500,000 worth of, yes, $500,000. So that's $500,000, good. $500,000 worth of trade per year in invertebrates in Australia. One of the concerning things is when she looks across these different marketplace types, this is what we call in ecology a species accumulation curve. So as you sample through space or time, or in this case websites, the number of species you find, you expect to plateau. There is no plateaus in any of these across the 5 years. We still don't know how many species are actually being traded, and I find that really remarkable. So, stealing a concept from Ella's fabulous talk at the start, how organised or disorganised is wildlife and environmental crime, particularly in Australia? So internationally we know that there are huge organisations supporting some of the traditional wildlife commodities. So these are photos from a seizure in Singapore in 2019. At the time, in March, it was the biggest seizure of pangolin scales and elephant ivory that had ever been seen in the world. It was dwarfed a couple of months later. But we're talking 12 tonnes of pangolin scales dried and 9 tonnes of elephant ivory. Who knows what a pangolin is? Or who doesn't know what a pangolin is? Who would like to... Oh, good, okay, because I was hoping that someone wouldn't know what it was, so I thought I'd put one up. The first time I asked who knew what a pangolin was at one of these conferences 10 years ago, only 3 people put up their hands, so I feel like I've been doing an okay job. So that's what a pangolin is. So a big pangolin could have around 3 kilos of these carotid scales. So they're the same substance as your fingernails or hair. They're the only scaled mammal. They're not an armadillo. They don't have the bony structure. They are external scales. They're solitary. They only have 1 young per year. So if you do some quick maths, it's not really maths, it's just arithmetic. You take 12 tonnes, you divide it by 3 kilograms. The minimum number of these animals is 4,000 that were killed for that. And that's a very minimum, that's conservative. There's going to be tens of thousands that were actually killed for that shipment. But that's not Australia. Well, what about Australia? Well, yes, we definitely see organised crime happening in Australia. So fisheries, the number of boats that the ABF sinking has increased by 40% each year over the last 5 years. We're seeing a growing criminal syndication around the horticultural trade. So there's a number of species which you just either can't or don't want to try and grow from propagation or seed because they're just too long-lived. So we're seeing these groups going in to national parks and pulling out these mature epiphytes or ferns, or in this case grass trees. They're then selling them to nurseries or laundering them back into legal horticulture. Back in the 1980s, the story of the foxtail palm in Queensland was sort of iconic. The palm seeds were highly desirable in international markets, and so criminal gangs got heavily involved. These were gangs that had access to a lot of firearms. They were also taking drugs in and out of Indonesia and swapping them for palm seeds, so it was so valuable that they could actually swap seeds for drugs, and there was clear connections to the Queensland government at the time. Sandalwood in South Australia, transported across the Nullarbor in huge amounts, to the point that it's actually putting pressure on the last remaining remnant native populations. So, clearly organised at all levels, including our reptile smuggling, which we talked about earlier. One of the most interesting developments in sort of the organised crime areas is the illegal firewood harvest. So Victoria, New South Wales in particular, and Western Australia, the take of firewood is now becoming one of the greatest threats to habitat integrity across national parks and public spaces, and a problem also increasingly for leasehold forestry. So it's difficult to detect and investigate with the growing cost of living crisis, with the already here but soon to be worse energy crisis that we see. Firewood is becoming an increasingly valuable commodity. It's worth a lot. It's worth so much that organised groups are investing in their own machinery. They're buying logging trucks so that they can move very quickly into forestry areas, remove wood and take it out and sell it largely on online marketplaces. So it's been commercialised quickly through online trade. And so far, prosecutions have had very, very low and poor outcomes as well, because the judiciary just don't understand the economics behind these crimes. So, a shameless plug for who we are. We are the Wildlife Crime Research Hub at Adelaide University. We're a large team of interdisciplinary researchers that works across environmental law, cybersecurity, wildlife forensics in partnership with the Australian Museum's Wildlife Genomics Labs. We have a big data science and biodiversity and conservation program as well. And it's always a pleasure and a privilege to come and speak to you, and I'm hoping that this will have generated some thoughts, some ideas and some conversations. We're sitting at table 15 mostly, so it's not just me you have to talk to. You can come and talk to lots of other more interesting people as well. So, thank you very much.